They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there.
We don't need to go populist left or populist right. We don't need to embrace neo-Marxism or neo-fascism, these disastrous movements from the 20th century. Turns out the answer is pretty much our Bill of Rights, our story. Embrace freedom. That's the answer.
And if the LP has a purpose, it's not to put people to sleep. It's to wake them up.
We're here because we love liberty. And we're here because we hate injustice. We are here to save mankind. We are here to fight.
Join us, the Libertarian Party, in perhaps the most exciting, grandest endeavor in history, the restoration of American liberty.
Ideas spread, they can't stop them. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government.
Hello and welcome to episode 84 of Decentralized Revolution, a podcast from the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus and Mises PAC. I'm Aaron Harris and I'm your host. Of course, here at the Mises Caucus, a foundational sort of motivation for the caucus was to bring an Austrian understanding of economics to the Libertarian Party here in the United States and just to politics in general. And of course, if you're fairly new to all this, it has a little to do with the country of Austria or any inherent Austrian qualities, but why we call it that is because of the economists who were working in Austria, starting, I think, with Karl Menger in the late 1800s and on up to including Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, people like that who, of course, were named after the great Ludwig von Mises. The greatest economist of all time, is a very failed podcaster by the name of Dave Smith likes to describe him. And the thing about Austrian economics is it's the only school of thought that really has a handle on explaining some of what are the great economic issues of right now, which is inflation, how our money seems to always be losing its value, and something, that's going on right now. And then, of course, something that I think is going to happen very soon, and that's a bust in the boom and bust cycle. We had a big bust, of course, in 2008, and a lot of people on the Austrian side have said, we haven't really changed anything that caused the underlying things that caused that crash in 2008 have not been changed. And if anything, the policies have gotten worse as far as what the Federal Reserve is doing. And so in addition to, having the need for we libertarians to speak out against how the government is handling inflation, unfortunately, we're going to have the opportunity to do that when it comes to the boom-bust cycle here very soon, because I think if we're not already, we're going to be in a really bad recession. And of course, one thing that's different about right now, as opposed to 2008, one key factor, I think, is the rise of cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin. And I personally have just wanted to learn more about Bitcoin, and I know a lot more people maybe are sometimes afraid to ask questions because you think, as libertarians, we're supposed to know all this stuff. And some of the stuff I know a lot better than the average man on the street, but on some stuff I'm kind of dumb on. And so I asked my colleagues on the Mises Caucus board, and she's no longer on the board, but I asked Angela McCardle what she thought about who I should have on to talk about Bitcoin from an Austro-libertarian perspective, and her one and only answer was Stephan Livera. Of course, I think she had just recently talked to Stephan on the Bitcoin sort of live stream they had for the National LP as a fundraiser, And she was obviously impressed by Stephan there if she had not been familiar with him before. And of course, I have been very impressed by my talk with him. And he really got into a lot of core things and also kind of explained, I intentionally kind of played dumb. Some questions I kind of knew the answer to, some I didn't. And so I kind of tried to take it down to a very basic level. So if you're a Jedi when it comes to Bitcoin, this may be a little bit below your level, but I hope that it will maybe help you be able to talk about this to normal people. And I hope that you learn something about this if you're not that advanced on how to maybe work Bitcoin into your financial life, especially given, I think, what we're on the cusp of experiencing. So Stephan Livera is the host of the Stephan Livera Podcast, where he breaks down a lot of this stuff. So we're going to have a link to that over on the show notes page at decentralizedrevolution.com/84. Stephan is also the managing director over at Swan Bitcoin International. We'll have a link to that site on the show notes page as well. And what are the odds? Our last guest here on Decentralized Revolution was from Western Australia. And Stephan is also from Australia. He has a background as a chartered accountant over there. And I think he's from New South Wales, if I'm wrong on that, or if he's just spent some time there. I apologize. But he's written a lot about Bitcoin and about Austrian economics, and I think we're all going to learn a lot from this one. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. You were able to accommodate me very quickly. I just asked for some time a couple of days ago, and very honored to have you on. Tell everybody a little bit about you. Some people may already know who listen to this podcast with the Mises Caucus because you were recently on that live stream with Angela and some other LP people around Bitcoin. But for those who maybe didn't catch that, tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got into Austrian economics.
Yeah, sure. So I first got into Austrian economics. I was about 14, 15 years old, and I was on IRC, and I was in a politics channel. And this guy kept linking to Mises daily articles. And at the time, I just thought, oh, no, this is crazy. Like, how would this ever work? It's like, et cetera, right? Like most people. And then I found that actually, over time, it actually made a lot more sense than what the teachers at my school and later at university were teaching me. So basically, from about the age of, I'd say about 15, 16, I was a libertarian and was into Austrian economics. I mean, I've got it even up here on the shelf. I've got a bunch of the Austrian classics up here. I came in, through basically the Mises Institute. I was reading and consuming a lot of material there. And so in terms of, what I do nowadays, I'm known mainly in my work as a Bitcoin podcaster. So I host Stephan Livera Podcast, one of the world's leading Bitcoin podcasts, interviewing leading people in the world of Bitcoin in terms of developers, analysts, researchers, entrepreneurs, CEOs, investors. But I also have a focus on Austrian economics as part of the podcast. So that's probably the main thing and the main aspect that I do. But I also work at Swan. So I work at Swan Bitcoin, so swan.com, and that's where also people can buy Bitcoin and also learn about Bitcoin. So those are the main things I'm involved in, but I also do things like contributing by writing articles for Bitcoin Magazine. I also invest in Bitcoin companies through this venture called Bitcoin Adventures. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah. It's amazing. You said, hey, this stuff, sounded weird compared to what you hear from everywhere else. And then you get into it and it is really just elegant and beautiful. Like I realized that I've been an Austrian economist, or at least have an Austrian economic outlook my whole life because my dad, I used to collect baseball cards and I would get this, they published a price list of baseball cards every month. It's called Beckett Baseball Card Monthly. And I would get this and I'd be like, oh, look, my 1988 Roger Clemens is worth $10. And my dad would say, well, it's only worth what somebody is willing to pay for it. Right. So in other words, like I got the lesson and it clicked like the subjective, like value is subjective and it's not an objective store of value. And a transaction is both parties being better off, not doing an equal swap. It's amazing how just proceeding from the action axiom leads you to all these common sense, logical conclusions that when you're in economics class in freshman year in college, they load you up with all this crap and you're like, this doesn't make sense. I don't want to learn this. So it's what those of us who discover the Austrian approach, it's like, wow, it's just so common sense.
Absolutely. So I think that is something that for me as a teenager, I couldn't quite understand why that was, but it just kind of clicked. It just kind of made sense. And then only later, once I started to read the books and started to understand more about the actual methodology, the praxeological method, that's when it started to click a bit more. And by then, this is more like university age for me, kind of 20, 21, this age. Then I was starting to really grasp it a little bit more clearly in terms of why I think this approach makes more sense. And so, that was essentially part of my journey in terms of becoming an Austro-libertarian.
Did you study economics in college, in university?
I studied commerce at school. So as part of that, they give you a little bit of the, the basic economics. They call it micro and macroeconomics. But my actual focus back at university was accounting and finance and information systems as well.
Okay. So I told you a little bit right before we jumped on that, sometimes I prepare a lot for interviews and sometimes I don't. And this is one of those times that I didn't on purpose, because what I want to do is, as libertarians, we have been, our focus is on understanding economics. One of our great things, opposing the empire and war and stuff is kind of another pillar of that. But we've been, I know we, especially in America, we've been, hey, inflation is going to happen, and the 2008 crash happened for a certain reason. And, what's going on now is going to lead to something very much like that. And here's why. And, year after year, the bubble keeps getting bigger and people don't want to listen because they're just like, oh, I don't know. You're just like a gold investor or, but now that, we have double digit inflation, it's being reported in the news is like 9-10%, but it's probably bigger. And so now people are really wanting to know, at least they're more receptive to an explanation of why the economy is the way it is. When, there's baby formula shortages on the shelves, gas is $5 a gallon, all of these things people want to know. And so I wanted to get someone who could help explain to us kind of how maybe we can explain it to others. So how we can fully understand what's going on, what role, central banking plays in all of this, and then the alternative of crypto. And I know there's and I am a beginner level person on crypto. I get the bigger idea. Some of the nuts and bolts I'm not good on. I see when I tune into even in the libertarian sphere, people with crypto, I hear all kinds of divergent opinion that Bitcoin is where it's at, that Bitcoin is garbage, that Bitcoin is good for this, but not for that. So I want to sort out a lot of those things in the crypto space for myself. So I know how to A, explain it to other people, and B, how to arrange my financial affairs. But let's start with, you're at a cocktail party. People are like, geez, this inflation sucks. So what do we say at that moment right now?
We work hard to earn money and they can just print more of it. That's the short version. Now, of course, we can explain further and we can talk about that and say, look, ultimately, your fiat US dollars or whatever fiat you operate in, they can print more of it. And fundamentally, that's the problem. It's that people can control the money supply. They can inflate it, and those people who get that new money first are the ones who win out of this. Right. And so I think that's the high level way to explain it. Of course, not everybody will resonate with that, or not everybody will be ready to hear that message. But the ones who you can get through to, those are the ones you try to help them. You try to help them understand that at this time, the money is just fundamentally broken. And so a lot of people are not even using fiat currency to save. They are using property or stocks or bonds or gold to save. And so once you can get them to that point, that's then the point where you can introduce and say, well, what would a better money look like? Well, it would be fungible. It would be scarce. Bitcoin, there'll never be more than 21 million Bitcoin. It's durable. It's identifiable. It's verifiable. It's transportable. And so you can put it in that way and explain that Bitcoin achieves the best of both worlds, of gold and of fiat money. So another way to come at this, and another way to explain this, is to say, look, from that Misesian, of course, maybe if you're at a cocktail party, you're not going to go deeply into this idea of Misesian and salableness and things like this. But if you think of this idea like gold can store your value across time, but not easily across space.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to send it, well, you're going to have to put it on a ship. You're going to have to fly it there. It's not cheap. That's not a convenient thing for trade. Now, if you want to use dollars to send internationally, well, yeah, they can travel very quickly, but they won't store your value very well over time, as everybody is now coming to notice. So Bitcoin is this non-state controlled, it's a neutral, open protocol for money that achieves the best of both worlds. That's how I would explain it. And so if I was talking to somebody and I had to just give them one concept and say, look, if you just took this one concept and this is all you learned, just think of it like digital savings technology. If you can just think of it like that, that's probably the easiest way to think about it. Now, I can appreciate at this point we'll get all kinds of pushback. They might say, well, hang on, it's been really volatile. So from my answer, my point of view on this is you have to think of it as a long-term thing. So anyone who is saving and stacking for the long term, they have done very well. And this is why at Swan, we talk about this idea of auto DCA or Bitcoin savings plan. The idea is, you set up whatever it is, however much you can afford. You can buy a small fraction of Bitcoin and you could be doing $10 a day or whatever, $50 a week or however much you can afford. And statistically, if you were doing that, you ended up dramatically over, let's say, a period of 5 years or longer. And so when you frame it in that way, then it really does become very clear that this is the way to save. And it's also a parallel alternative because people can do commerce today using Bitcoin and the Lightning Network to send and receive. And even I do this. I receive some of my income in Bitcoin and then I pay out some of my stuff in Bitcoin using the Lightning Network. And so this is a real world thing that some people are doing today. Now, there are different levels to this. There are some people who are, let's say, they're just starting and they're just dipping their toe. They might just take a small piece of Bitcoin. They might buy a small amount. And then there are people who are regularly buying a little bit more. And they may see it more like, okay, I'm kind of speculating a little bit. I'm sort of, I'm just taking a little bit of a punt, let's say. But then eventually there are people who think of it like, no, this is my savings. I just regularly save. This is how I save. I earn some money. I buy some Bitcoin. I pay my bills and I buy Bitcoin. And for the long term, that has done quite well for them. And then there are other people who I value my net worth in Bitcoin terms. So however many Bitcoin or Satoshis, a Bitcoin is divisible to 100 million Satoshis. So they're thinking of it in those terms because they're really focused on the long term. They see it like scarcity is one of the most, if not the most important component of money. And Bitcoin solves that in a way because there'll never be more than 21 million. And the network effects around Bitcoin versus the altcoins, there's 20,000 altcoins. None of them have actually surpassed Bitcoin. And so it's useful to think of it as Bitcoin has these network effects and it uniquely has these qualities that enable it to win over the long term. And that's essentially one of the views. Another view as well, now speaking to a libertarian audience, this message will resonate more as well. It's that governments can fund themselves with all this cheap debt. And unfortunately, gold has not been able to restrain governments. Governments were able to restrain gold. They were able to capture custodians. They were able to monitor the ways that people could transact it internationally. Whereas with Bitcoin, I can scan a QR code from you and I can pay you right this instant, and it's just like an email. And realistically, it's not easy to stop that.
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the key points. So anyway, I'll just stop there and see if you have any further questions or where else you want to go into.
Yeah, there's a lot there. One, it's kind of an elementary thing, so we can kind of get it out of the way, is sometimes I hear that, well, one of the characteristics of why gold is money and of anything that serves as money, it has to have some sort of use value in and of itself. Like, gold, you can make jewelry out of it. If you're in prison and cigarettes are used as money, well, you can smoke the cigarette or somebody can smoke it. So one elementary criticism I hear is like, well, even though it's Bitcoin is, there's a fixed amount, it's just ones and zeros. So it has no intrinsic is the right word. It has no other use other than as this medium of exchange. So how does it get that leap from ones and zeros to being money? And maybe is Bitcoin money? That's I've heard some very smart, very good libertarians debate that point. So talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So I'll take those points in order. So to the first point, generally speaking, I think we are assessing this commodity on how good it is at performing the role of money. Once Bitcoin has already achieved a price, it's not like it needs to retain some kind of use value. Instead, we can think of it as it's all goods are competing in a market to become money. It's just that the most saleable one, as Mises says in Theory of Money and Credit, that there is a tendency towards the most saleable commodity. And so those of us in the Bitcoin or Bitcoin maximalist camp, let's say, are arguing precisely that it will become the most saleable money. Now, to your second question about whether it's money today, I think it really depends on how we're defining it. If we're talking generally accepted money around the world, obviously no, it's not money yet. But we believe that it's on this pathway, and that how else would it look other than seeing millions of people, arguably 1% to 2% of the world today hold some Bitcoin. So we're still very early in terms of global adoption. But in certain places, absolutely, Bitcoin would qualify as money. So for example, if you are in Bitcoin Beach in El Zonte in El Salvador, it is money. Bitcoin is legal tender in El Salvador, and it is just the main means of transacting in that town. Now, in El Salvador, it is legal tender, but of course, it's not necessarily used as the main means of payment or method of payment in every circumstance. Of course, a lot of people are still trading with US dollar, but I think in certain communities and in certain places, it already is money. The question about whether it becomes money broadly, that's a long-term question. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know exactly when that will be. I think, if anything, if I were to look at what is the likely outcome, I think it may well be that in the short to medium term, US dollar actually does well relative to other fiat monies. Now, that's not me endorsing the US dollar or the fractional reserve banking system. Of course, I'm opposed to that. I just see it like perhaps in the short to medium term, the US dollar might actually do well relative to other fiat currencies. And we're seeing this with the recent euro to USD parity. But of course, my view is in the long term, Bitcoin does win out because it has that scarce limit and because it is an open and neutral system. So I see it as a long-term winner, and that's why I'm trying to accumulate it now. But at the same time, I see a big potential, and I would ideally like more libertarian people to hold some and to be able to use it, either for their savings or for commerce.
Yep. So backing up a little bit, so I'm one of these guys, I kick myself all the time because I'm not a computer guy. I was a journalist, and I'm a history and English and that sort of guy. And back in like late 2013, early 2014, I actually tried to get into Bitcoin. I heard about it. I tried to figure it out. I couldn't do it. and I just kind of gave up. It was too complicated for me. So I'm kicking myself, because if I would have put, $1,000 into it back then. And I still have a little bit of a barrier. So you said you want more libertarians to use it. So I think there's a lot of people who are, they may have spouses who are just like, well, we're trying to make ends meet. Why am I spending money? Why are we putting money over here? There is some like, how do we do this? So I want to get into like practically how someone who is a kind of a newbie can start to get into this. And let's start with kind of where I am right now is like, I have not a lot, but more than a little bit on like Coinbase. And I realize that that's probably not the best way to do it. So why might that not be the best way to do it? And what are my steps to getting to a more advantageous way to have and use Bitcoin?
Yeah, sure. So as you may have heard, many people in the Bitcoin world, we have this saying, it's not your keys, not your coins. Meaning, he who holds the private keys is the one who can use those coins. So right now, what you have with Coinbase is not Bitcoin, you have an IOU. You have Coinbase IOUs. If you want to convert them into real Bitcoin, what I suggest you do is get a phone wallet. So on your phone, for an example, I mean, even if people are listening right now and they want to go along, pull out your phone, open your browser, go to this website, muun.com. So muun.com. That's known as Moon Wallet. So you can pull it out on your phone, and it's got the App Store there or the Google Play link. So you can install that on your phone, and you can basically, just like a click, spin up what's called a Bitcoin wallet, or you can think of it like a Bitcoin viewer if you want. But anyway, the broad point is you can use this Bitcoin wallet and it will create an address. So if you go to once you've created this and installed the wallet and opened it, and then you can click receive as an example. You can click receive, and then it will show an address. It will show a QR code and this address that starts with BC1, etc. So what you can do is then copy and paste that address, go log into Coinbase or whichever website, or if you're with us with swan.com, and then you can then find the withdrawal section to withdraw some Bitcoin. And so what you can do is start out with a small amount, even just $100 or $50, just to kind of get comfortable with it. And then you can copy paste in that address, that BC1, etc., blah, blah, blah. And then hit enter, withdraw. I want to withdraw my coins. And then Coinbase or whoever your provider is will send you those. And this is actually a great moment to understand, because those of us who are anti-fractional reserve banking, those of us who don't want to place too much trust into centralized custodians, this is the way to put it into practice. And so this is the first step. Of course, there are lots of other steps, but I'm just trying to give you the basic, this is your first thing that you do to really own your Bitcoin and take control of that Bitcoin. Now, to be fair, one other thing I'll say is in this Moon wallet, as an example, it's got a little section called security. And that's basically like a little backup. So you'll go through and you'll write down and it'll give you the instructions. One has like an email backup, and another is also, if you don't want to do your email, you can do the backup where you write it down. And then basically if you were to ever lose that phone, or that phone were to get damaged or whatever, you could then recover those coins. And then later, once you want to improve your security, that's where you might get what's called a hardware signing device. So, for example, the cold card. So I'm showing that on screen right now. So this is a hardware, well, it used to be called a hardware wallet, but now we're calling them a signing device. Basically, what it does is it can retain the private keys on your device, and it can sign the messages that are what you do when you're spending Bitcoin. So again, I don't want to go too technical. I'm just trying to keep it very basic for people who don't want to get overwhelmed. And so that's the high level of how you would get started with a Bitcoin wallet. So do you have any questions at this point?
Yeah. So go into a little bit more detail on why the not your keys, not your coins. What are the different scenarios in which what I have in Coinbase could all of a sudden not be accessible to me?
So there's lots of reasons. So this space is rife with exchange failures and in cases where exchanges might even do what's known as shotgun KYC, or they may ask you additional questions before letting you take those coins into your own custody. So this is the equivalent of buying gold and leaving it in the vault and not taking physical possession of the coins yourself, or the bars or whatever. So the thing is, there have been exchange hacks all the time. This has been a regular thing in Bitcoin. And also, it centralizes the ownership of Bitcoin. Whereas as libertarians, we want the idea to be distributed around the world, many people. And I mean, there are millions of people who are using these Bitcoin wallets, but you should be part of it. And so that's why I highly encourage people to, understand the mantra, not your keys, not your coins. And what it's referring to, just to explain what's going on, think of it like your Bitcoin wallet is generating a private key. And so the way when you spend Bitcoin, your Bitcoin wallet is signing a message, and there's cryptography involved where it signs a message without revealing the private key. And so then, as an example, if you generate a Bitcoin address, and you can generate lots of Bitcoin addresses, and I can spend money to you, I can put money into your lockbox, let's say, but I can't take it out without what? Your private key. So that's why I can send you money. Think of it like a push system. I can push that money to your wallet or to your address, and you are the only one who can spend it because you keep that private key to yourself. Because, as we say, not your keys, not your coins.
So now that they're still in Coinbase, I remember, wasn't it back after the 2008 crash? I know Greece met, there was I think it was around the same time, they had like what was called a bail-in, right? Where the government was like, didn't they just basically like seize savings accounts and things like that to shore up the banks? So theoretically, I guess the government, they could do it under the guise of, drug dealers use Bitcoin, or Bitcoin is destabilizing the economy. So therefore Coinbase, we're, coming in with guns and subpoenas, and all of a sudden, even if Coinbase wanted to make good on their promises, and even if they were, fully solvent and, operational, it could be, the government could basically come in and take all that because Bitcoin holds the keys, right?
Well, in that case, Coinbase holds your keys.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yes,
Coinbase.
Yeah. But you're correct. Like, you're correct there. So look, bail-ins happen, and at the end of the day, the idea of Bitcoin is that you can use it peer to peer. So you don't have to leave and trust with these custodians. You can take control for yourself. And this is something we all should do as libertarians. And then when we are helping our family and friends who want to learn to save, we should be teaching them to use self-custody as well. Use their own wallets and don't leave coins on the exchange or with the brokerage and so on like that. You might purchase on an exchange, but then you withdraw to your self-custody. So that's the important piece, because that is actually what makes it difficult for the overall system to be shut down in a way. Because when everybody's self-custodying, even if they were to try to go around and subpoena all the exchanges, it would be sort of like, well, you're going to have to go and talk to all these millions of Bitcoin holders, not just in this country, but around the world. How are you going to stop this thing? So I think understanding that and understanding how you can meaningfully contribute to the system and make the system better, that's part of this journey of becoming a Bitcoiner.
Yeah. And in those early days of Bitcoin, when I tried to figure it out, one of the selling points about it, but also for opponents, one of the scary things about it was that, it's untrackable. You can buy human beings on the dark web and nuclear bombs and things like that. And now I hear a lot of people saying that, no, you can't really do that. Basically, I was having a conversation. Well, let's say I overheard a conversation with someone who was saying, is there a way to basically, and I'm not asking you to answer this any way than how you want to, but theoretically, how would one have digital currency and shield it from taxation or surveillance or something like that? So right when we, you showed me how to do the wallet on my phone. Well, presumably the government can get into my phone. So how much is Bitcoin really, it is definitely decentralized, what I can tell, but still is it still trackable? And like, let's say I, buy, $1,000 worth of something, and I get audited or something, like, is that something that is, how much anonymity and security from government is there, along with the decentralization inherent in using it with your own
I
wallet?
understand the question. Yeah. So let me explain a few things here. So if you're interested to use Bitcoin privately, then there are tools you can use around that, and you can acquire Bitcoin without KYC. So KYC stands for Know Your Customer. So typically when you sign up with a bank, you're having to give, let's say, your driver's license or your passport or some kind of identifying information, things like this. Now, in Bitcoin, you can purchase on exchanges, but there are also non-KYC means of acquiring the coin. So as an example, you might go to your local Bitcoin meetup and you might buy just off another guy at the meetup. Hey, I want to buy $100 worth of Bitcoin. And he might have some on his Moon wallet or whatever other Bitcoin wallet or any other Lightning Bitcoin wallet, and spend it into your wallet and say, hey, Aaron, give me $100 cash, and here you go. Here's $100 I've just sent you over Bitcoin. Done. And so that's one way you can acquire non-KYC coins. And so in the industry, people might call it non-KYC coins.
Okay.
And so there are different ways to acquire coins. You might even earn them. So another example is, let's say you mentioned you were a writer before. So as an example, you might be working for a site or an editor who says, hey, I'll pay you in Bitcoin. Give me your address. That's another way to earn non-KYC coins. Now, it gets complicated if you actually want to be private. Of course, I have hundreds of hours of episodes on my podcast, and a range of those talking about how to use Bitcoin privately. So for people who are interested, you can check that out. But the high-level answer is to use privacy techniques and wallets that prioritize privacy. So a quick example for listeners who are using Android, you can look at this wallet called Samurai Wallet. So if you search Samurai Wallet in the Google Play Store, that will be a good starter. I've done interviews with the team from Samurai Wallet and some of the associated people. So for people who are interested, you can listen to those episodes. That's one high-level answer. Another answer is there is a wallet called Sparrow Wallet. So that's a desktop wallet. You can put that on your laptop or your desktop. That one includes some privacy techniques if you wish to use them. So those are some high-level tips. But I think the important point for most people is to just get started. Because what happens for some people is they come into what I call analysis paralysis, because they're sort of thinking about how to do it perfectly. They just never even get started.
Yep.
So look, if private acquisition of Bitcoin is what you're looking for, I would suggest look for a local Bitcoin meetup and go and meet the people and just ask, hey, can I just buy $50 off you? I'll give you cash. I bet you there'll be a lot of people who would say, hey, yeah, fine. You know what? Pull out Moon Wallet or whatever, Samurai Wallet or whichever one, and just do it like that. And then you'll start to see, oh, wow, okay, hang on. I just did this peer-to-peer. I don't actually have to go through custodians and platforms and exchanges. Now, there are trade-offs, to be clear. If you want to buy a larger amount, you might not be able to do that all peer-to-peer. It might not be that easy, depending on where you are, depending on who you know, depending on things like this. And it might not be as convenient. So that's probably one of the other trade-offs. But there might be a privacy gain. So I'm just trying to give people the options. These are some of the options out there.
So back in the example you gave of someone offering me, as a writer and editor, I could say, I'll accept Bitcoin too. So let's assume now, of course, if they, if they send me a W-2 or, whatever tax form saying they gave me money, that it would be there. But let's just say that, I get, an antique guitar off of you for $10,000, and I paid you that money in Bitcoin. But if I send it from like Coinbase or something like that, is there a record of it going? It's just a record of it going to an anonymous account, right?
So it depends how far you think things would go. I would suggest for most people, if you're purchasing KYC coin, you want to just hodl in Bitcoin we say this word hodl, right? So you might just hodl those coins. Whereas if you're spending, you might just want to have a smaller amount that you acquired non-KYC for spending. And so you might think of it like that. But there are different aspects of it, because let's think of it like this, right? So imagine future down the track, or even now, Coinbase shares records with, let's say, the IRS or with someone else. And at that point, they could sort of ask, well, hang on, was this a spend? Was this to your wallet, etc.? You could have the questions asked of you. And at that point, they may say, hang on, there's a capital gain here because you purchased those coins, let's say, at $20,000 and you spent them now at $40,000. You had a $20,000 gain, etc. So there's different, I guess, aspects to that. But the safe, I guess, way is to just buy and hodl and just stack those sats, and ideally in your own self-custody wallet.
Right.
And, you know, people can sort of separate things and have, let's say, a non-KYC smaller amount that they're doing if they're doing like peer-to-peer things. Or let's say you earn some coins that were just not tied to any record of your name, etc.
Yeah. So what about, you see Bitcoin ATMs here and there. What purpose do they serve?
So some of them, it's a convenience thing because people want to just be able to go in person. Some of them will have a high premium, though, that you will end up paying. Some of them don't have KYC or below certain thresholds. So sometimes people will use it like that. In other cases, it's just a convenience thing, or just because sometimes people aren't really thinking about doing things online. They just want to do it in person. And then the ATM is sometimes that's how they do that. So, you know, there's different aspects to that.
So there was another time, I believe maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when Bitcoin was at a high and a lot of people were trying to get into it. And then I started hearing about, backups on the network and high transaction fees. And again, like from when I first heard about Bitcoin, it's like, oh, it's just this low to zero transaction fee. Like if you and I agreed on a transaction with no transaction fee, we could do that and it would be instantaneous and all this. And then I started hearing about, again, these backups that you couldn't do your thing instantaneously and that there was a high cost associated with it. So what was that? Is it still a thing?
Yeah, sure. So there are different reasons as to why the space evolved in a certain way. Nowadays, we have this technique called the Lightning Network. And so Moon Wallet, the one I showed you, can actually use that. So that's actually one way you can use to do those cheaper transactions. And Moon Wallet automatically supports that. So that's one aspect that makes it easier. Now, in terms of historically what was happening, there's a few factors. One was that the techniques used for Bitcoin on-chain payments were not as efficient as what's used today. So without going too into the technical details, the exchanges and the wallets nowadays are using more advanced techniques that can basically do more for less. Think of it like that. So they can achieve more for less. They use batching techniques and they use various more advanced technology to achieve cheaper transactions than what was happening 3 or 4 years ago. Now, to be clear, it's possible and it may even be likely longer term that on-chain fees, in terms of sending a Bitcoin transaction on-chain, the fees for that could rise. But that's where we can use other techniques, things like Lightning Network and things like that. So it's impossible for me to give you an exact, it will cost less than $1 for this much time. I can't give you that because no one knows. But at least where we are today, it's quite feasible for people to just do transactions on-chain. But longer term, we will use more advanced techniques like Lightning and things like this. But most of those are built into some of these wallets that I typically will recommend and coach people towards. So that way, they don't really have to think too hard about it. They just use these wallets and it already deals with some of those congestion moments better. Now, I think without going too into technical details, that's kind of the short version. But yeah, we could go further into that, but it might not be the right audience.
Okay. So let's talk about, more and more ways that Bitcoin can become serve the function of money for more and more people. So again, once in a while, I've heard stories of people in, the Congo using Bitcoin to, conduct transactions or something like that on their smartphones. And it seems the potential for that, helping people who are unbanked be able to, send and receive money. I think of when I like to go to this Mexican grocery store because they have a little restaurant there. And of course they have a thing, send money back to Mexico, and there's fees associated with that. So theoretically, at some point, we could get to a point where people could send money back and forth across borders with a very low transaction fee. So is that sort of thing happening with Bitcoin? And what do you see, how do you see us getting from here to there, where that decentralizing thing, but again, just think of how there are lots of ways I could think of that sort of ability for, poor people and rich people to send money across borders with, a lot of privacy and a little bit of cost, what that does to the power of the state. As a libertarian, I'm very intrigued by that. So what positive things are going on there? What are some
Sure.
hurdles that are keeping us from getting there?
Yeah, sure. So to answer your first question around use in countries around the world, yes, it is being used all over the world by good people and by bad people, to be fair. We see it like Bitcoin is just neutral money. It's going to be used by good people and bad people. Whether you are a person trying to help refugees out of Eritrea, I did an interview recently with a lady who was doing that and helping people, the diaspora of people, or whether you are using it to help fund journalists and activists in an adversarial condition where, let's say, they are trying to speak out against tyranny. Right. It is being used in scenarios like this. It's being used by Putin's political rivals to take donations. For 7 years, they've been using this. It's used in cases where, let's say, there are websites that are not favorable to a regime, or websites that are, let's say, making content available. So things like Sci-Hub.
WikiLeaks too, right?
Well, yeah, WikiLeaks is probably the famous example as well. So there are all kinds of scenarios where people are using it just around the world. And you mentioned as well remittance. So yeah, definitely there are remittance markets and people using Bitcoin just to send even to their friends and family abroad, or for donations for politically challenged causes, things like the Canadian truckers, or even, the Dutch farmers and things like this. People can send donations very simply and easily. So I think in a way it just enables transactions without having to think so hard about it. I'll make an analogy. So for people who are old enough, they remember having to make an international phone call where you had to dial special dial codes and you had to pay a lot more. But nowadays, in the age of Skype and Signal and WhatsApp and online calls, we don't really even think about it like that. And I think it's the same kind of thing. Bitcoin is bringing that back, where we don't have to think about whether it's an international transaction. And if anyone has done an international fiat wire, like trying to wire USD internationally, it's a huge pain. Think about all these fields you have to get right. You have to get this SWIFT code right and this thing right. And if any one of those things is wrong, the bank will send it back and it'll be transaction failed. Oh no, then you got to do it again and it'll take days. With Bitcoin, you can send it and it's done straight away, just like, sending an email. And that's the way it should be. Mm-hmm. So I think there's all kinds of potential and possibility, but in terms of the pathway for that, I think it goes with people regularly stacking and saving, because the central banks and the fiat system is not just going to go with enough people advocating for the gold standard. It's just not going to happen. And even like hypothetical, let's imagine we even did. What would keep us on the gold standard? They would probably just destroy the system or recapture it like they did in 1913 or in 1971. So Bitcoin is actually the long-term answer here. It's just that not enough people understand it, and we have to grow the base of Bitcoin users, holders, stackers, merchants, developers, miners, businesses. All of these things are things that need to grow, because I honestly believe it's the best hope at actually improving liberty in our lifetimes. That because of the savings potential and the ability for transactions, just peer-to-peer, it absolutely helps improve liberty and our chances for liberty. And I really think longer term, we'll see as more and more people grasp and understand why Bitcoin is better money, it's more saleable money, or it has better qualities, it achieves things that the fiat system could literally never provide. It gives us assurances that the fiat system cannot provide. And so I see it like over time, people will stop stacking, say, ETFs and bonds, or even in their retirement funds and things like this. They'll stop buying bonds. And what does that do? Well, guess what? It raises the cost of debt for governments. And what does that do? It forces governments to be smaller. They'll have to right size. And especially at a time like this, when governments are in big, big debt around the world, we are starting to see some real issues come up, even in places like Japan, where they have something like 260% debt to government debt to GDP. It's starting to cause issues in terms of currencies. And so I think perhaps people like you, Aaron, and the listeners of this podcast are probably more intellectually minded, or at least willing to consider the intellectual reasons why Bitcoin is a good thing. But I think a lot of people will actually have to just learn the hard way. They'll have to learn through pain. And it's sad, but I think that's sort of the reality. And so if you look at countries like Argentina, they've had currency crises every decade or something like this for the last 100 years. They've had this. So they understand that they don't want to hold the local currency. They want to try to hold USD. And now more and more of them are also learning about Bitcoin as well. So I just see it as a process of growing the base of Bitcoin users and holders. And so really what this is distributing the Bitcoins out around the world. And part of how that happens is more and more people understand why Bitcoin is a better money. And they have, quote unquote, orange pilled themselves and seen that Bitcoin is a big part of the answer.
Yeah. So how much do governments and central banks have they got this figured out, and what are they trying to do to stop it? Given that it is, I think, as we libertarians and Austrians see it as the reason why we like it is the reason probably they hate it, and they're trying to stop it. So where are they at on this?
So the interesting thing is, I think a lot of them fundamentally aren't bullish enough on Bitcoin because some of them haven't really done the reading on it. And so they just see it as like, oh, you guys have your little digital gold thing. We don't really care about, that's the commodity, whatever. We don't really care that much about it. Other parts of the world, maybe they're challenging it a little bit more. But fundamentally, people inside the government have their own incentive too. And they might be personally wanting to stack Bitcoin. And, it might well be that there are people even and this is obviously confronting to think about, but there may be politicians who literally hold Bitcoin for themselves while banning the population from holding it. It's not inconceivable that kind of thing happens. We saw that in Ukraine, where literally because of this whole Russia-Ukraine war, the Ukrainian authorities, I believe they banned people from, I think, buying Bitcoin using the Ukrainian currency. Or they banned some, I can't remember exactly what it was, but essentially they were trying to stop the exits. But at the same time, people can use this thing peer-to-peer. You can be international. You can be working online. You can be in Nigeria and doing web development and earning Bitcoin. How are they going to stop that? So at the end of the day, I think the technology is out there, and I think we're just going through a process of the world waking up to it and realizing what this is. And here's the other component. I believe there are some politicians who arguably see this as a good thing. They really do believe that Bitcoin is a good thing. So, for example, President Bukele of El Salvador believes it's a good thing. There are people like Cynthia Lummis or Warren Davidson in the US who are out there talking about Bitcoin and saying, yeah, we need to advocate for reasonable Bitcoin policy. And so they see it as and obviously they might tend to be more right-wing leaning politicians who see government debt as an issue, and they see it like, actually, Bitcoin has good qualities as a store of value. So we will see all kinds of political opposition, but at the same time, growing the base of Bitcoin holders and users can make persecuting Bitcoin users less palatable. In the same way that raising taxes is less palatable. Yeah. I think growing the base of users is actually part of how to stop that. And so that's why I think it's important that every libertarian get on the Bitcoin train, because it is honestly the best shot at improving liberty in our lifetimes.
Yeah. So one thing, again, this may have absolutely zero credence to it, but I've heard some people say that, oh, Bitcoin is really the CIA did it, and it's paving the way for a digital, a government or a central bank controlled digital currency. I'll just let you respond to that. Is there?
Yeah, of course. Bitcoin is the opposite of these things. The code is open source. It's out there in the open. Anybody can contribute to it. And the ironic thing is we are moving into an age where there is a war on cash. Mm-hmm. And arguably, the hysteria of the last few years accelerated that war on cash, because less people were even using physical cash. They were trying to use their cards, tap and pay, electronic transfers, EFT, all of this stuff. Bitcoin is actually part of the answer, because we are moving into a world where they will put in CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. Bitcoin is actually the open and free alternative. And so this is another reason for which libertarians should be some of the loudest people trying to gain adoption for Bitcoin, because it is the free and open system. It's not like a walled garden. Any Bitcoin wallet can pay another Bitcoin wallet. It's an open system. It's not like this kind of Apple walled garden ecosystem where they only let you install the apps that they tell you. It's not like, and don't forget, like, let's be clear, with central bank digital currencies, they can control what you spend on. Right. So we can think of those really more like surveillance coins. They are surveillance coins and inflationary coins. So they will be going down over time, whereas Bitcoin is scarce, and long term, I expect it's going up over time. So I think that's another important imperative and reason for people, if they're concerned about this whole idea of a surveillance coin, then that's the pathway the world is on right now. Yeah. And adopting Bitcoin is actually part of how you can start building an alternative, whether that is having a corner shop, or I think you guys call it a bodega, or things like that, where you might pay that guy with Bitcoin, and or you might earn some of your income using Bitcoin. Or you might have family and friends overseas, and you can send them some money using Bitcoin, and they can sell it locally in their Bitcoin to fiat markets, because these markets are liquid and they're growing over time. And because Bitcoin is the market leader, the liquidity for it is the best around the world in terms of Bitcoin versus other altcoins. So I think these are all parts of the reasons why Bitcoin should be rightly seen as freedom money.
Yeah. One of the kind of scenario I see starting to play out in terms of how the governments and central banks are going to play this is they see, it's funny because sometimes they different sides of their mouth, they'll say, well, Bitcoin is unstable, it's a Ponzi scheme, but on the other hand, they talk about how dangerous it is and undermining their currency or some other form of the economy. But I think what I see kind of happening is they see that, the average man on the street is seeing that, hey, there is some utility to Bitcoin. It kind of works. And then with a financial crisis, I think the governments and central banks will step in and say, hey, okay, this is best of both worlds. We have this digital currency that has all the good features that Bitcoin has, but none of the bad features. So why don't you all start using this? And they may not give people a choice. I'm sure it'll be kind of like the jab that, they'll ask and then they'll severely limit your options. But am I kind of reading that right? That they're going to try to use Bitcoin's success as a way to sell those, you call them central bank digital currencies?
So in some cases, yes, but in other cases, they may just ram it down everyone's throat. They may just say, look, we're just updating. And the funny thing is, most money today, in terms of fiat money, is already digital. It's already controlled and surveilled. It is the amount of cash and coins as a percentage of the overall money supply is some tiny fraction. So it already is digital. They're just going to obviously have this marketing pitch of, CBDCs, look. And sometimes they just all play copycat. So they see some other government or some other central bank somewhere talking about a CBDC. So they think, oh, okay, well, we better do that too. The reality is, though, it's not going to have any privacy, and it will not have any of the store of value qualities that Bitcoin has, because as we all know, fiat is just guaranteed to lose value over time, whereas Bitcoin is scarce.
Yeah. So a central bank digital currency would almost be literally the opposite of Bitcoin in every important respect, in that it'll all be basically centrally administered, right? You probably all, and again, technically speaking, you basically all have to go through the same point for the transactions to happen. They'll all be approved and monitored by the middle, and that they can literally, with the stroke of a pen, even more quickly than they can now, they could just all of a sudden, okay, everybody's money is worth, everybody has 10% less money or something like that. So it would be literally
interest rates. Yeah.
Say,
it allows them to do negative interest rates. It might allow them to say, hey, Aaron, you've been spending too much on meat. Let's get you to eat some bugs now instead, or you're not allowed to fly, but the elites are allowed to fly because we've coded that into how the CBDC works. It allows all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And that's
social credit. Social credit.
It's all part of. It's all driving towards the same system where they it seems that there are these efforts to try to cut against national sovereignty. And you're seeing this now with things like the World Economic Forum and all this stuff, and the EU and things like this. They're cutting against national sovereignty, and that's the direction they're trying to push this. And so I think as libertarians, we should be using technology to help liberate ourselves and help save the people who can be saved.
Yeah. Another criticism I see, and I haven't looked into this, but I see it as a pretty transparent way to kind of poison the well against Bitcoin, is you'll see people like Elizabeth Warren or, the government in California say, oh, well, it's dangerous to the environment. Bitcoin is dangerous to the environment. What? Explain that. Explain that.
So the short version of it is basically and in most cases they lie about the statistics, but they basically extrapolate incorrectly based on the per transaction amount for a Bitcoin transaction, without recognizing that Bitcoin's energy use does not scale based on transactions. That's just not the way it works. But of course, many people will lie about this. They will quote this guy, Digi-economist, and let's just note, he is an employee of the Dutch central bank. So he's not even, he doesn't disclose his conflict of interest, and he continually makes these statements that have been refuted over and over and over. But the short version of it is Bitcoin is worth it. Bitcoin is worth the energy. We should be taking the approach that we should be using more energy. More energy is correlated and is is part of the cause of how we can have nice quality of life. And so we should not shy away from that. But even today, we should point out that the energy use of the entire Bitcoin network is still less than people using their drying machines. And here's the other thing. We should also reject this entire frame of the electricity police, right? I don't run around talking to people being like, hey, look at all the energy you're using for scrolling on Instagram and your TikTok videos. They're using too much energy. You could just not do that. You could just not use a washing machine or a drying machine and just hand wash everything. Wouldn't that be more efficient? Well, no, it wouldn't be. It would not achieve the same thing that Bitcoin's proof of work does. It allows us to have this neutral system, and the neutral system is worth it, because the alternative to that is a century of war and all of the problems that large statism has brought us.
Yeah. So just to kind of go into a little more detail for somebody who's a beginner, or again, who may want to address the critics of Bitcoin. So here down near Knoxville, there's a big Bitcoin mining, farm or whatever they call it going in. That's, it's supposedly big, huge building using a lot of energy. So again, the sort of a normal man on the street might say, hey, I hear what you just said, but look, there's this huge building that looks like it's an Amazon distribution thing. And it's, all it does is, it's crunching numbers for Bitcoin. And of course that has to use a lot of energy. So why are there things like that? And go into a little more of why that energy use has value.
So fundamentally, Bitcoin mining can be thought of like a decentralized lottery. So you can have a Bitcoin mining machine and you can plug it in, and that will have hash power. And that hash power is pointed to a mining pool, and that's, the miners will compete to win a block. And basically they're trying to target to find a number below a certain value, but it's not something that can be, I guess, there's not necessarily like an algorithm to do it faster. You just have to use this SHA-256 and think of it like you're randomly guessing. And so if you are contributing, let's say, 10% of the hash rate of the network, which is massive nowadays, you have a 10% chance of being the one to find that next block. And so without going into too much detail, the point of all of this stuff is to make it so that people can tie the real world into the system of Bitcoin. And so Bitcoin does not have a connection to the outside world other than through that proof of work. And so, I mean, I'm being a little bit oversimplifying, but the point is Bitcoin uses this to generate its own idea of time, and that also is actually part of how we have an objective way of coming to consensus in Bitcoin. And so even though all these nodes are around the world and millions of people are transacting around the world, they are able to come to consensus on average every 10 minutes when the next Bitcoin block is found. And the only way we can do that in a decentralized way without reverting back to the fiat system is using proof of work. There is no alternative. And so this is, while it may seem computationally expensive and wasteful on the face of it, the actual cost of it is well worth it. Reason being, the money, if we were to operate on a Bitcoin standard, the money cost of that is to compare by standards. So we should compare what is the cost of the fiat standard? Well, under the fiat standard, we've had a century of war. We've had all these massive expansions in the size of the state. Under, let's say, a gold standard, yes, okay, we could look at all that quote unquote, wasteful energy spent by gold miners. And it's a similar debate, actually, that the comparison of the gold standard and the costs of the gold standard is to compare the gold standard versus the fiat standard. Well, in the same way, we're comparing the Bitcoin standard, this scarce money that is decentralized. And it just so happens that through a combination of the different technology involved, this is how you keep the system decentralized and not having one person who controls it, or one company or one government who controls the system. It's a distributed system. Bitcoin's nodes all around the world, now we're not going to get too technical, but basically a Bitcoin node is how you can verify your Bitcoin and you can participate in the Bitcoin network this way. And so these Bitcoin nodes, there's probably 50,000 or 100,000 of them around the world, and they are what is responsible for governing, let's say, the rules of the Bitcoin network. And so when you use a Bitcoin wallet, it's connecting either to someone else's Bitcoin node or to your own Bitcoin node. So I won't get into too much detail there, but the high-level answer is that those nodes are what protect the overall rules of the game, let's say, the 21 million cap, the rules around transactions and blocks.
Let's we have a little bit of time left. I want you to talk about, again, this is as someone who kind of gets the big idea about Bitcoin and crypto. I find it difficult to sort out all the different claims of all the other digital currencies. What's Bitcoin Cash? What's Monero? What's Doge? All this stuff. And I think you mentioned there's 20,000 of them. There's probably been 100 more created since we've been talking. But let's deal with maybe just the issue of what makes Bitcoin different, and maybe talk about some of the other the better example. As a way to do that, talk about some of the better examples of crypto coins out there and what the difference is.
Right. So the short version of it is that Bitcoin is the only one that's genuinely decentralized. And a lot of the other coins are actually centralized in some way, or they're making some kind of trade-off. Now, people were free to compete, but in many cases, a lot of these coins had a pre-mine where they gave the founders, or let's say certain community members or insiders and influencers, a certain allocation of the coins. A lot of these coins make various trade-offs in ways that are not apparent to the newcomer or the casual observer that they may not be as secure, they may not be as robust, they may not be as verifiable for various reasons, or they may not be as cheap when you think about the level of scale that Bitcoin is at. They may just be sort of taking advantage of the fact that they're just kind of very small and not really used at all, and then they can say, oh, look, see, we're cheaper than Bitcoin transactions. But the reality is if you scaled up the transactions that of that small coin to Bitcoin's level, you would find, actually, yeah, it would fall down in some other way, that it's actually more expensive, or that it's actually not secure, or that it's actually not robust, or it's actually not verifiable. So with Bitcoin, it's trying to balance across all of these components, because the idea is anybody could run a Bitcoin node, that it's the average, just retail, average guy on the street, he could afford to run a Bitcoin node. And so that's one guiding idea, and there's this idea of accessibility with Bitcoin. So I think those are some of the key ideas. With some of the altcoins, essentially a lot of them have some kind of benevolent dictator or somebody who is in control of that project, or they could be pressured in a certain way. Or there's a foundation that's this centralized entity controlling the thing. A lot of these altcoins are rightly to be considered more like a company. They're more like an equity. They're not actually they're not actually to be considered monetary competition. Some of them are open about that. Some of them are just trying to do something else. Fine, whatever. But they're not trying to be money. There are others that are, I guess, quote unquote, trying to be money. But that's where you actually need to take a very skeptical eye to the claims made. And the interesting thing here is with Bitcoin, Satoshi, the founder of Bitcoin, left the project in, I believe, 2011. So there is no benevolent dictator in Bitcoin. Even if Satoshi came back now, his views would not necessarily carry merit. Like, people wouldn't just necessarily do what Satoshi says, because the project has moved on since then. Mm-hmm. So I think the important point to understand, as I was saying before, is that Bitcoin is genuinely decentralized, and a lot of the altcoins are simply not. And the other factor here is there's a liquidity. Because Bitcoin is bigger, people can do larger trades in Bitcoin without moving the price. So for anybody who's a trader, they might understand this when they're looking at an order book or when they're doing trades. They may see, okay, there's only a certain amount I can trade at this price before I start really moving the price. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Bitcoin, now, of course, it's still small relative to other markets today, but we believe it'll grow. So as we speak today, call it 450 billion, something in that range. The total market for Bitcoin is about that. It would be difficult for a large corporate entity to buy into, let's say, some of these other smaller coins, because they would just move the price themselves if they did. Whereas with Bitcoin, MicroStrategy were able to take a position. Tesla took a position, although they sold some recently. There are other companies and countries like El Salvador who took a position because Bitcoin was big enough. So that matters, because let's say you want to use it to send to they will send to, their family and friends in different countries. And that matters because your family or friend member in that other country might need to be able to sell locally. So that's also important to consider.
Explain Bitcoin Cash?
So this is like a big saga. Basically, there was this thing called the block size wars. And this occurred over the years, let's say 2015, 16, and culminated in 2017 with the creation of Bcash, or Bitcoin Cash. Now, there were well-known promoters, people like Roger Ver, who was a well-known guy in the libertarian world. And basically, it's become very clear that their approach didn't work. It wasn't the sustainable, scalable way, because now a Bcash token is a small fraction of Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And the technology now in Bitcoin is so much more advanced that you can use Lightning Network to achieve extremely cheap transactions anyway. So I think the high-level answer at that point is, on that point, is to see that basically there were people who wanted to be able to retain a certain promise of cheap transactions on-chain forever. But the other part of the community, let's say the small block aspect of the community, were saying, no, that's going to centralize the system. And so they would run calculations and show, no, this is going to centralize the system. You're going to tend the system into centralization, and we should counter that. We should not do this. We should look for more technological ways of approaching this and scaling. And that's where things like Lightning Network and other... Lightning Network is not the only layer 2. There are other ways of doing things, things like sidechains. There are other approaches in terms of how scaling can be done. We shouldn't necessarily put everything on chain. And so a really good book for those people who really want to dive deep on this is called The Block Size Wars by Jonathan Beer. But the short version of it is Bcash lost. I mean, ultimately, it is a tiny fraction of what Bitcoin was. It's become very clear now, what are we, almost 5 years on, that it basically became a bit of a ghost town. Yes, there's some people who talk about it, and yeah, they talk about it big on Twitter, but if you actually look at the numbers of how many transactions there are versus Bitcoin and the Lightning Network, many of which those transactions don't even show up on those blockchain explorers, we have literally millions of potential users who can use Lightning today when you sum up across all of the different platforms, exchanges, wallets. If you add up across all of these, there are reports coming out saying that approximately 80 million people have access to the Lightning Network today. So, and that's just Lightning Network. I mean, people can just use Bitcoin on chain without using a Lightning service or wallet or application. So there's just a lot of things to that, but I understand this was a big point of confusion for a lot of libertarians because they saw Roger Ver as, oh, hey, he's a well-known libertarian. I should go with him, right? I should use his coin. Unfortunately, though, he and the people who followed him made a bad technical choice. And the thing is, there were other Austro-libertarians who were saying no, like who were on the small block side of that war. So... Okay. In a nutshell, I think it's become clear now that there are better ways to scale.
Yeah. So let's talk about ways that people can get into this more based on what they've heard here today. I know you have a lot of resources. Go into some of those. I don't know if specific podcast episodes might be, that you might recommend, or just getting into your podcast or another. Are there online communities that are trusted that you'll, mostly good information about all this stuff? Where do we go to learn more?
Yeah, sure. So StephanLivera.com, or if you are using podcast apps, you can search my name, Stephan Livera Podcast, Livera. And so basically I host a show where I interview a lot of the leading people in Bitcoin. I try to keep it simple for people. And following on Twitter is probably the main way to keep up with things. And of course, go to swan.com. And there is a $10 sign up bonus for people who use swan.com/Livera. If they sign up and start stacking with Swan, there's a $10 free sign up bonus there for people. So those are probably the main ways, or the main two things I would recommend for people who want to. I would just suggest just take a small position, like even if you are kind of unsure about it, I would say just buy a small amount or acquire a small amount and start learning, and you'll probably find that there's so much more to it than what you first thought.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so who are just maybe a couple of people that are trusted commentators about this that you like to listen to kind of expand so Swan Network, Stephan Livera. Who else is good? Because again, I get into some of this, and I have a hard time judging sometimes who's. And I'm not asking you to criticize anybody, but who are good voices to listen to about this?
Yeah, sure. So a few good people. There's my friend Safety Namus. He's the author of the Bitcoin Standard, so he's a good guy to follow. My friend Pierre Rashad, and people can follow him. He's got the Twitter handle Bitcoin Pierre, or on Twitter he's also he's got an account Bitcoin is Savings. So I recommend people follow that account. Who else? There's Guy Swan. He's got a good podcast called Bitcoin Audible. There's Marty Bent and Matt Odell. So they host a podcast called Tales from the Crypt and Rabbit Hole Recap. So those are a few people who are well known in the space. There's Michael Goldstein at Bitstein. So he's another Austro-libertarian. So people like Safedine, Pierre, another friend of mine, VJ Boyapati. So he's on Twitter, real_VJ. He's written this book called The Bullish Case for Bitcoin.
Okay.
So those are a few off the top of my head. But I think basically once you start listening, once people start listening to my podcast and seeing who I'm interviewing, or start seeing even the resources that Swan Bitcoin creates. There's a bunch of podcasts and articles and free books available over at Swan Bitcoin as well. So those are some ways to get into this and start learning.
Okay, great. I really appreciate your time. We'll put all those links on the show notes page. And hopefully Bitcoin will continue to take off, and we'll have some more. It'll be interesting maybe after a year or so of a recession or whatever to kind of reassess and see both where the economy is and where Bitcoin is, and compare that with what kind of the corporate media says about it versus what the people who actually know about Bitcoin say
and actually,
about it.
That reminds me, one final point I would like to make here is just to understand that Bitcoin has cycles, right? It just like it had cycles in 2013, 2017, 2021. The best time to stack and to accumulate is in these bear cycles, because once the cycle turns back, then you're very happy that you accumulated quite cheaply. So I think that's probably the main point I'd leave people with. And again, thank you for having me on, Aaron.
Okay, great, Stephan. Thanks a lot. And there you have it. I'd like to thank Stephan Livera for his time and wisdom and for working with me on scheduling. He's over in Dubai, I think it is. And so I had to figure out the time difference and all that. And he was very accommodating. I appreciate that. Links to Stephan's stuff, his Twitter, Swan Bitcoin International, other places that you can engage with Stephan. All that info is going to be up at decentralizedrevolution.com/84. Thanks to Dave vs. Goliath for all the music you hear on Decentralized Revolution. And thanks to everyone who subscribes to our email list and gives to Mises PAC at takeyouinaction.com. And everyone who shares, rates, reviews, and subscribes to Decentralized Revolution. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.